Hello there. In this video, I'm going to be analyzing some common arguments against abortion, and I won't be arguing that they succeed or fail. Instead, I'll defend a much more modest claim, namely that these arguments rely on a highly controversial assumption about sexual morality. So, if you thought you could justify the wrongness of abortion merely with premises about the wrongness of killing innocent people, I think that's mistaken. Obviously, abortion has been at the forefront of the culture wars for a very long time. These days, especially so, given that there are various restrictions being passed in certain places. So it's worth getting super clear on what the central assumptions underlying this dispute are. If you're an opponent of abortion, if you try to argue for the wrongness of abortion, it's worth getting clear on what assumptions you're going to have to justify to make that case. If you're a proponent of abortion rights, if you think abortion is not wrong, at least in most cases, it's worth getting super clear on what the best line of attack is on the arguments against it. All right. So, as usual, I'm going to start with a very simple argument and make a series of revisions until we get to the best one. Here's argument A, premise 1. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human. Premise 2. To get an abortion is to intentionally kill an innocent human. Conclusion, so it's always wrong to get an abortion. All right? It's a very common argument. I'm sure we've all heard this sort of argument expressed somewhere before. It's a valid argument. The premises entail the conclusion. So the question is, should we accept these premises? Well, I think you might try to challenge the second premise in various ways. For instance, you might try to challenge the idea that a fetus is a human being in the relevant sense. You might try to challenge the idea that abortion is the intentional killing as opposed to merely the foreseen killing. In other words, what you're intending is the removal of the fetus from your body, and the fact that it dies is merely a foreseen side effect. Or you might challenge the idea that it's killing at all, as opposed to allowing to die by withholding necessary support. So I think those are all lines of attack you might try if you're trying to challenge the second premise, but I'm not going to challenge the second premise in this video. I'm going to grant it, and I'm going to be focusing on the first premise here. All right. So the first premise, the moral premise, says it's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human. Now that might strike you as plausible on the face of it, as a general principle, but I think ultimately we should reject it. I think it's subject to some pretty compelling counterexamples, and I'll give you one here. This one's called Crushed to Death by Bob. So, the case goes like this. An extremely massive individual, Bob, is falling on Sally through no fault of his own. If he lands on her, he'll crush her to death. The only way for Sally to prevent this is to shoot him with a laser that will disintegrate him and kill him. She shoots him with the laser. Okay, and here is what I'm going to call intuition 1. Sally does nothing wrong. Okay, I expect most people to share this intuition. Sally does nothing wrong in saving her own life by killing Bob, right? Now, there might be some outliers who don't accept it, but I think the vast majority of you will. So, let's look back at the argument and see that we have a counterexample to this first premise, right? Sally intentionally kills an innocent human. Bob is innocent. He's falling on her through no fault of his own. Sally does nothing wrong. That's intuition 1. Therefore, the first premise is false. So we're going to need to revise this argument in order to get around this counterexample. Here's argument B. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human that is not posing a threat to your life. To get an abortion, except in the life of the mother cases, is to intentionally kill an innocent human that is not posing a threat to your life. So it's always wrong to get an abortion, except in the life of the mother cases. So notice we've had to qualify the second premise in the conclusion. We've added a little exception clause for cases in which the mother's life is severely threatened by the pregnancy. But notice So the conclusion no longer claims that abortion's always wrong. It claims that abortion's wrong in all cases other than the life of the mother cases. The first premise, notice, now avoids our crushed to death by Bob counterexample, since Bob is posing a threat to Sally's life. However, I think it's subject to a very similar counterexample. This one's called crushed to captivity by Bob. It goes like this. An extremely massive individual, Bob, is falling on Sally through no fault of his own. If he lands on her, he'll crush her in such a way that will render her immobile for 9 months. Let's say no one's around to help. Luckily, he has a year's supply of food and bottled water on him, so she can survive until then. It's pretty lucky, right? The only way for Sally to prevent this or free herself is to shoot him with a laser that will disintegrate him and kill him. She shoots him with the laser. Okay? So we're going to call intuition 2. Sally does nothing wrong here. Okay? Again, I expect most people to share this intuition. It's a very unfortunate situation for Bob, right? He's not at fault here, but Sally does nothing wrong in freeing herself from this 9-month captivity, even at the cost of killing Bob. All right, so back to the argument. We can see we have a counterexample to the first premise, since Sally intentionally kills an innocent human that's not posing a threat to her life, and Sally does nothing wrong. So the first premise is false. Let's try another revision to get around it. Argument C. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human that is not infringing on your life or freedom of movement. Premise 2. To get an abortion, except in life of the mother cases, or cases in which the pregnancy would render the mother bedridden, okay, is to intentionally kill an innocent human that is not infringing on your life or freedom of movement. So it's always wrong to get an abortion, except in the life of the mother or bedridden cases. Okay, so again, we've had to add another exception clause to the second premise in the conclusion, but we're arguing for the wrongness of abortion in all the other cases. Now, our first premise avoids the previous counterexample, crushed to captivity by Bob, since in that case, Bob is infringing on Sally's freedom of movement. However, once again, I think we should ultimately reject it. I think it's subject to another compelling counterexample. This one's called crushed to parasitism by Bob. Okay. An individual, Bob, is falling on Sally through no fault of his own. If he lands on her, he'll shrink and become implanted in her body for 9 months. His presence in her body won't necessarily threaten her life, though it will negatively affect her body in certain ways and otherwise inconvenience her. The only way for Sally to remove Bob from her body is to shoot him with a laser that will disintegrate him and kill him. She shoots him with the laser. Okay? And I'm going to call intuition 3. Sally does nothing wrong in this case. Now, I expect there might be people who were on board with the previous intuitions, but maybe they no longer share this intuition. However, I still expect the vast majority of people to have this intuition. That is to say, if another human, through no fault of their own, ends up somehow embedded in your body for 9 months, maybe you'd be a super nice person to let them stay there, but you don't do anything wrong in removing them, even at the cost of killing them. Okay? So, let's look at this argument. Again, argument C. And we have a counterexample to this first premise. Sally intentionally kills an innocent human that is not posing a threat to her life or freedom of movement. Sally does nothing wrong, so the first premise is false. Okay, let's move on to our next version to see if we can get around this counterexample. Argument D. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human that is not infringing on your life, freedom, or bodily autonomy, etc. To get an abortion, except in the life of the mother or bedridden cases, is to intentionally kill an innocent human that is not infringing on your life, freedom, bodily autonomy, etc. So, it's always wrong to get an abortion, except in the life of the mother or bedridden cases. So now we've avoided the crushed to parasitism by Bob counterexample, since in that case Bob is infringing on Sally's bodily autonomy. But now take a look at the second premise here. right? To get an abortion is to intentionally kill an innocent human that's not infringing on your life, freedom, bodily autonomy, etc. This premise is clearly false, right? The fetus is infringing on your bodily autonomy. So what I'm going to do here is return back to our original argument so we can try to brainstorm some other strategies for fixing it. All right? So here's argument A. And remember that the counterexamples to this first premise were all of these Bob cases. Crushed to death, crushed to captivity, and crushed to parasitism by Bob. So let's think about some strategies for revising the argument to get around these counterexamples. And here are 3 strategies that come to mind off the top of my head. We've already tried this first one, to create exceptions for rights infringements. And if you recall, this one failed because we first made an exception for threatening your life, then for threatening your freedom of movement, and finally for threatening your bodily autonomy. But by the time we get to that one, we can no longer maintain the second premise. Okay? Here are 2 other strategies for trying to revise this argument. We can try to appeal to the biological mother-child relationship, or we can try to appeal to the mother's responsibility for the situation. All right? So we're going to try each of these other strategies in order and see if anything promising results. So here we have argument E. Okay? Premise 1. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human, that is your direct offspring. To get an abortion is to... My clicker's acting up, I apologize. To get an abortion is to intentionally kill an innocent human, that is your direct offspring. So it's always wrong to get an abortion. Right? So notice this avoids all the Bob counterexamples, assuming that Bob was just some random person who ended up in an unfortunate situation relative to Sally. However, I think this first premise is subject to a very similar series of counterexamples. So the first one's called crushed to death by Rob. An extremely massive individual, Rob, is falling on Sally through no fault of his own. If he lands on her, he'll crush her to death. The only way for Sally to prevent this is to shoot him with a laser that will disintegrate him and kill him. She shoots him with the laser. So far, it's the exact same as the crushed to death by Bob case, but here's the twist. Also, Rob happens to be the long-lost direct offspring of Sally. Her eggs were stolen many years ago and used to create Rob. If it helps with the timeline, we can say that there was some time travel involved. That's fine. Sally finds this out before she makes her decision. And here we have what I'm going to call intuition 4. Sally does nothing wrong. Okay? So, again, if you're on board with the previous counterexamples, I don't expect this direct offspring link to change anything for most of you. Certainly doesn't for me. So let's look back at the argument, right? And now we have a counterexample to the first premise. Since Sally intentionally kills an innocent human, that is her direct offspring. She does nothing wrong. So the first premise is false. Now here are a couple other counterexamples to the first premise. Crushed to captivity by Rob. Crushed to parasitism by Rob. These are cases exactly like the original Bob cases, except with the added twist about Rob turning out to be Sally's long-lost direct offspring. Again, I expect the intuition, if you shared it in the Bob cases, to be the exact same in the Rob cases. In other words, the biologic relationship doesn't seem to change much. So obviously, in order to get around these counterexamples, we might try the old strategy of adding some exceptions for rights infringements and get something like this, argument F. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human that is your direct offspring and is not infringing on your life, freedom, bodily autonomy, etc. To get an abortion, except in the relevant exceptions, right, is to intentionally kill an innocent human that is your direct offspring and is infringing on your life, freedom, bodily autonomy, etc. So it's always wrong to get an abortion. Now, the first premise avoids all the Bob and Rob counterexamples, but at the cost of making the second premise clearly false, right? The fetus, while it is your direct offspring, it is infringing on your bodily autonomy. So just as before, the exceptions for rights infringements didn't help, once again, it doesn't seem to help, even with the added direct offspring relationship. So, back to the drawing board, back to our original argument, argument A, and let's take another look at our strategies for dealing with the Bob and Rob counterexamples. We had exceptions for rights infringements, that failed. We have appeal to the biological mother-child relationship, that failed. So our final strategy that we're going to try is to appeal to the mother's responsibility for the situation. And here's a case that might motivate this idea, that might motivate the idea that this is the most promising strategy. Okay? This case is called Manipulative Genius Sally. All right? Sally has been in love with Bob for many years. She finally asks him out, but he rejects her. Feeling super spurned, she decides to kill him. However, she has a very strong sense of morality and doesn't want to do anything that she sees as morally wrong. So, she devises the following plan. She will arrange circumstances so that the situation in the crush to parasitism by Bob case comes to fruition. In other words, she will concoct a scenario in which Bob will be made to fall on her through no fault of his own, in such a way that he will shrink and become implanted in her for 9 months unless she intervenes by disintegrating him with the laser. She successfully carries out this plan and kills him. Okay, and here's what I'm going to call Intuition 5. Goddamn my clicker. Sorry about that. Intuition 5, Sally does do something wrong. Okay, so in all the previous cases, we had the intuition that Sally does nothing wrong. This case, I expect almost everyone to have the opposite intuition. In this case, Sally does do something wrong by killing Bob. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is try to think about this case and find out what the morally relevant difference is, right? What is the morally relevant difference between the manipulative genius Sally case and all the previous cases that can explain why it's suddenly wrong to kill Bob? Okay? And I think the answer should be relatively obvious. In the previous cases, Sally is not at fault for her circumstances, so she has the right to protect her life, liberty, or bodily autonomy, even by killing Bob. Whereas in the manipulative genius Sally case, Sally is at fault for her circumstances, so she does not have the right to protect her life, liberty, or bodily autonomy by killing Bob. Because of Sally's manipulations, Bob acquires the right to infringe on her life, liberty, or bodily autonomy without being killed. Right? So again, because in the manipulative genius Sally case, she's at fault for the whole scenario, that's what grants Bob the right to infringe on her either life, liberty, or bodily autonomy without being killed. So let's see if we can extract from this a way of revising our argument in order to avoid all of the other counterexamples that we've noticed. This brings us to argument G. Premise 1. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human, even if that human is infringing on your bodily autonomy, provided that you have somehow granted it the right to infringe on your bodily autonomy. Premise 2. To get an abortion is to intentionally kill an innocent human that is infringing on your bodily autonomy, but you have granted it the right to infringe on your bodily autonomy. Conclusion. So, it's always wrong to get an abortion. Okay? So, this first premise here, moral premise, avoids all of the original Bob and Rob counterexamples, right? In those cases, Sally was not at fault for her situation, so she hasn't done anything that has granted Bob or Rob the right to infringe on her bodily autonomy or her other rights, whereas this premise does not allow in the manipulative genius Sally case, right? In that case, she has somehow granted Bob the right to infringe on her. Okay, so this first premise looks like it's a good new premise to use given all the previous counterexamples and given the lesson drawn from the manipulative genius Sally case. But notice now our second premise is extremely controversial, right? To get an abortion is to intentionally kill an innocent human that is infringing on your bodily autonomy, but you have granted it the right to infringe on your bodily autonomy. Okay? So what I want to do before I take a look at this controversial component is I want to rewrite the argument one final time, bring us to our final version, and I want to isolate the controversial assumption. Okay, so I'm going to pick apart the second premise into two premises so that we can take a closer look at the highly controversial assumption. So, argument H. Premise 1. It's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human, even if that human is infringing on your bodily autonomy, provided that you have somehow granted it the right to infringe on your bodily autonomy. Premise 2. To get an abortion is to intentionally kill an innocent human that is infringing on your bodily autonomy. And then here we have the highly controversial assumption. You have granted the fetus the right to infringe on your bodily autonomy. Conclusion. So, it's always wrong to get an abortion. Okay? So, I think this third premise is extremely controversial, but I think, as we've seen from all the previous cases, it really does need to be justified in order for this argument to succeed in justifying this conclusion. Okay? So, how might we attempt to justify such a premise? Well, once again, let's take a look at it. You have granted the fetus the right to infringe on your bodily autonomy. Now, this premise seems to rely on the following highly controversial assumption regarding sexual morality. Namely, by having consensual sex, you thereby grant any potential fetus that might result the right to infringe on your bodily autonomy. I think this is the central assumption, the highly controversial assumption about sexual morality that our argument against abortion relies on. I think if you're attempting to justify the claim that abortion is wrong using the sort of arguments we've been looking at, I think you need to defend a premise like this. And if you are an opponent of these arguments, if you're trying to argue that these arguments fail, I think this is the assumption that you should be attacking. Okay? Now, I'm not going to say anything else about this assumption in this video. I won't be arguing that it's true or false. I think in some future video, I'm going to be considering some arguments for or against it. But to put my cards on the table, I do not accept this assumption. I do not think it's true. But if you disagree, if you think this assumption can be defended, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.